Welcome to GeoEconomics with Philosophy. I'm Norman Madarasz, your host for this program, in which I seek in English to give in-depth analysis of Brazilian current affairs, always relating it to my home country, Canada, or indeed the European Union or the broader G7. Today's episode is called Replacing the Translation. President Lula attends Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's G7 summit. I begin with a quote of President Lula being interviewed by Mano Brown from the hip-hop group Racionais MCs with Samaria Oliveira on the Mano a Mano podcast available on Spotify. This was recorded on June 19th, and it's at the 38th minute mark. I quote Lula. One thing was to be in the political opposition in the 1980s. You take the floor, the other guy take the floor, and after you get together. You weren't enemies, you were adversaries. Nowadays, no longer. The guys are enemies and treat you like an enemy, and they forgive nothing. Shortly after arriving at the G7 Grand Ball as Canada's freshly elected Prime Minister, Mark Carney's guest of honor, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, unequivocally conceded there to be no need for the organization to exist. Unlike the G20, it is, I quote him, not representative enough, he told a cohort of Brazilian journalists in Calgary. The G20 is more important, has greater human density, and more economic density. The word he should have pronounced, however, was BRICS. Whether his irony emboldened the truth or not, Lula shined at the summit. Prancing about as a court gesture, his shadow play offset his status as head statesman for the global south. Jester and King Lear packed into one. As a guest of honor on this great stage, Lula prophetically proved he could take on any role handed to him. Indeed, he chooses the one most appropriate for the moment. And that moment was one for political theater. In King Lear, the limit set by madness to reason seeks to preserve integrity from the arrogant scheming of wannabes. During the summit, Lula managed to bleach the ascetic gaunt of a Volodymyr Zelensky, a frequent hanger-on at G7 balls. He made a point to stride arm in arm with India's Narendra Modi and South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa. But from the wings, it was Mark Carney himself he was intent on testing. While the Canadian Prime Minister vowed confidently to recycle an abusive anti-metaboly, Canada's leadership must be defined not just by the strength of our values, but by the value of our strength, Lula complained about inconsistent translations. Although he commented little about Canada's failed green epic, increased military spending aimed primarily against his BRICS colleagues, Lula still seemed to brush Canadian values the wrong way. In his spoof, he raised the curtain of disbelief to reveal what nobody chose to admit. His host is the British Empire's new emissary, notwithstanding guarantees to national sovereignty. And to be sure, for one of the core leaders of the BRICS, it is no honor to be invited to a G7 summit. For the Brazilian, it was a waste of time, and Carney's crew capsized with far more than minor mistranslations. Incredulous, Lula's feeling must have amounted to wondering whom it was that Carney was speaking for and what NATO is planning for Brazil's commitment to BRICS. Wanting, not asking. The circumstances behind Mr. Carney's obtaining the Canadian leadership are as nebulous as the location of his personal wealth. A Ph.D. in economics from the Central Universities of the Anglo Empire, Carney represents the latest twist in the narrative of Britain's belief in its longue durée. The century in which Britain lost its grasp on a nightless planet has passed, though the circumstances for its fall have little to do with Germany, let alone Russia. As Michael Hudson has astutely shown in Super Imperialism, what did sink the empire was a financial torpedo sent from the United States. Drawing from the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations archival material, Hudson portrays the latter as surrounding the empire as if in a balance of payment spreadsheet replay of Yorktown. The American banking and intelligence sectors melted the empire down just enough to keep it from defaulting on unpayable loans. On the timescale of empires, never is one done until it becomes dusk. Britain sees none of it. After all, had China not itself regained its centrality following humiliation at the hands of 5 European powers and Japan? Had Russia not become the Soviet Union after repelling an invasion by no less than 11 foreign armies? Seldom are British philosophers Hegelian. They scoff at the idea of the end of history. And for empire does live. Now, after the Ukraine debacle, Canada has become Britain's new proxy in a seemingly Euro-centered NATO. Mr. Carney, who had infiltrated Goldman Sachs for Britain, is the only Canadian to have been governor of the Central Bank of England. Before that, he would churn out the austerity mantra while presiding over Canada's. Notice less is the hand he played to boost real estate assets while his predecessor, Justin Trudeau, marketed the positive side to mass immigration. Few Canadians need to be convinced of Trudeau's low IQ. However, it is only the naive who believe his staff had not foreseen the current housing crisis. How to lodge millions of newly arriving immigrants when the only housing the country constructs are high-end condominiums is a basic problem of arithmetic. Real estate owning Canadians will forgive him in the long haul, especially if their average household wealth climbs another 16% as it had over the previous 5 years. Notwithstanding Carney's bemused leer at Lula's translation spectacle, the Brazilian leader did posture to receive lessons from the former on political savviness. After all, here's a man now vowing for leadership of the G7 and NATO. Until Justin Trudeau's late-year flop in 2024, he was unknown to most Canadians. The Davos-infused Liberal Party's so-called primaries marketed a candidate who would be tough on Trump. And to his credit, the American president stands nonplussed regarding the Davos reset. Neither Trudeau nor current industry minister Mélanie Joly, let alone Kiev Banderite regime asset and former deputy PM Chrystia Freeland, received anything from Trump apart from a leer of his own. Trump sees right through the sores in them. Such was the case with Carney, who even managed not to be demeaned as governor of the 51st state. This has allowed him to predictably defend Canadian sovereignty against Russia and China, the BRICS no less, and summoned the King of England to pronounce the throne speech. Seemingly tough avant la lettre, Carney was kindly received in the Oval Office, and the president said nothing about his team being identical to Trudeau's. Neophytes are forgivable, especially when they are central bankers and asset managers. The White House even produced a sentimental video about the visit. So what is going on? For starters, President Trump's threats of annexation have worked deep into the Canadian and Quebecois electoral psyche. The population of the latter, usually cautious regarding the treachery of the federal Liberal Party, came running for the Prime Minister's umbrage. He came off as reassuring for the Fleur-de-Lis province, despite stumbling through the French language when unscripted. Fluency in French is almost obligatory for federal leaders. And on election night, Carney stripped the Quebec National Interest Party, Bloc Québécois, of a dozen seats despite leader Yves-François Blanchet's otherwise brilliant campaign. Then came the demolition of Canada's historic third party, the NDP. Its humiliating results came crashing down on its leadership as well as its official party status. On the federal level, at least, the NDP is no more. Perhaps the greatest surprise befell the Conservative Party, with Pierre Poilievre at its helms. For over a year, polls had pointed to a historical victory for Poilievre, with his boyish seminary student good looks and ideological verve halfway between libertarian bullying and a BA in Miesian Institute ignorance. Despite bettering even what the polls had predicted, Poilievre was neutralized after losing his seat in the Ottawa suburbs. Always an aspiring lord, Carney promised to call a by-election that would allow Poilievre to sit in Parliament as official leader of the opposition, should electors be kind to him. Meanwhile, the cultural agenda was stripped by the Liberals from the Conservatives, hitherto considered closest to the GOP in values. Caught off balance, Poilievre's worries mount as he now faces a leadership review. In the end, the leader now appearing to incarnate Trump north of the border is the current Prime Minister himself. As for Poilievre, faced with the lasso-wielding, rodeo-riding Premier of Alberta, Miss Danielle Smith, he risks being trampled by the wild mustangs of Western Canadian separatism he had once held in check. Indeed, in terms of the strategies by which to gain power and keep it, President Lula may have a lot to learn from Canada's new crop of wild roses. Lula's battle for tax justice against a racketeering Congress. On the heels of recent visits to Russia and Canada, Lula also accepted Carney's invitation to finally meet Donald J. Between the lines, he fitted on a fifth glass finger to see the things thou does not. Back home in Brazil, the capitalized military caste dominating Congress bullishly rejected Finance Minister Fernando Haddad's meager attempts at progressive tax reform. Among OCDE countries, Brazil shamelessly sports the lightest tax load on a cocktail of income, profit, and capital gains, while spiking taxation beyond compare in the mixology of goods, services, and consumption. For Minister Haddad's attempt at dispensing the poorest of the poor from paying income tax, Congress got moody. When he dared to introduce a Piketty-style additional 6% tax on online betting sites, whose poster boys are the country's roster of low-life soccer aces, stripping the needy from necessary funds to finance their university studies, and slap a meager 2% increase on financial transactions and overseas purchases, the so-called IOF, House Speaker Hugo Motta and Senate Leader David Alcolumbre presented him with a veto on a golden tray, although decrepit one. At bottom, what is at stake has little, if anything, to do with tax policy. The dispute focuses on the legalized form of corruption labeled parliamentary amendments. Custo Brasil is local jargon for the criminal conduct of those controlling business in the Congress. Emendas parlamentares impositivas names the weapon used by the plutocratic mafia controlling every layer of state politics, save for the executive branch and Supreme Court. Everything has an extra cost in the country, which only partly explains why 80 members of the lower house face some kind of investigation by the Supreme Court. The link between congressional plotting and these amendments is historic. On March 15th, 2015, impeachment proceedings were initiated against President Dilma Rousseff for refusing to allow such funds. Even so, for the MDB party to finally see their man Michel Temer usurp the presidency, congressional backbenchers, the so-called Centrão, demanded a generous cut of federal tax revenues otherwise destined for the federal payroll and infrastructure investment. Since 2020, this amount has been bloated to $40 billion, confirming the misnomer imposed parliamentary amendments. From 2016 to 2024, the amount transferred from the budget to the discretionary spending of individual members of Congress rose from $1 billion to $8 billion, a 700% increase. By the end of 2025, an additional $8.5 is to be channeled to Congress. This amounts to 22.8% of the budget in its totality. Given that 92% of the budget is locked into obligatory expenses, if congressional imposition continues, the country is bound for a fiscal meltdown. Faced with this recipe for disaster, by which the extreme center aims to jettison President Lula's economic successes, Supreme Court Justice Flavio Dino issued an order for more transparency on spending and an end to the secret budget, the secret congressional budget. The Constitution makes this requirement obligatory. Congresspersons must reveal how the money is being spent, thus ensuring there be as little as possible disbursed on an interest-first basis. Furthermore, Justice Dino rallied societal agents to explain the nature of these supplements in a public audience hosted by the Supreme Court. The overwhelming majority of those presenting papers reiterated how Congress does not have the right to decide upon budgetary spending. According to the 1988 Constitution, it is the prerogative of the executive branch alone to determine how additional resources will be spent on society, and not Congress's. Nevertheless, in the way the two House leaders reacted, the only name appropriate to describe it is criminal conduct. Upping the ante, the congressional crusaders leapt at society as a whole with an air choke. Raising energy costs by 6% yearly for 20 years, they overwrote the Constitution to usurp the prerogatives of the executive branch over public policy spending. In a bold standoff with the Supreme Court, Congress now moves to increase its numbers by approving the creation of dozens of new seats and hence millions of new reais being spent. Motto, Al-Kumbli and their gang are aiming at freezing increases to the minimum wage for 6 years while increasing their salaries by 3 times the inflation rate. Congressional fiscal overshoot with no oversight has been weaponized, a time bomb set in motion at the time of Dilma Rousseff's impeachment in 2016. On paper at least, the two houses of Congress have initiated a split in the division of powers. The name for this in law is coup d'etat. This insurrectional behavior within one of the country's elected bodies occurs on the same week as the UBS Global Wealth Report published its 2025 version. As an indicator of the congressional plutocrats should consider urgent, the report shows their country has plummeted to the bottom of the scale in world inequality. The same report reveals Brazil to have the most inherited wealth to intergenerationally hand down over the next 25 years, second only to Uncle Sam. With a mere 2 to 8% in inheritance tax, which varies according to state law, the indicator proves how the creation of wealth in Brazil, for all the Misesian hype over entrepreneurship, grows from within its traditional and untaxed families. Breaking with Gini index indicators, the USB Global World Report for 2024 reinforces the allure by which the bottom end of the upper class also adheres to this unjust economic model for success, no matter how badly they lose out in the end. For wealth is concentrated only at the very top in Brazil. Asset-based wealth soars along with the astronomical prime interest rates the central bank feeds to investors on silver spoons. The persistent legal theft orchestrated by Congress neutralizes the executive branch's attempts at progressive reforms on wealth distribution. Blow winds and crack your cheeks, rage blow, you cataracts and hurricanes. Befitting are King Lear's words here spat at the greedy. Meanwhile, Motto and Alcolumbri's henchmen work the ideological boards in shout before you argue setting committee hearings, otherwise aimed at informing the public of the causes for persistent poverty in what is now the world's 10th largest economy according to nominal GDP. Furthering the comparative perspective, according to the Paris School of Economics World Income Inequality Database, whereas in the United States the 1% owns 35% of national wealth, the Brazilian equivalent holds almost 50%. Given this political landscape, taking fascism to be the worst menace falters even as a strongman argument. Let's be clear here. Brazil's ruling class balks at nothing to retain its concentrated privileges, not even sponsoring training sessions offered by Tzahal in Israel for its pawns in power. Liberal socialists who keep flogging the theme of 1930s fascism merely reveal their reluctance to leave the fields of fetishistic analysis. Fiscal collapse awaits the Union by 2026, just in time for the next presidential election. Who runs the operation are the plutocrats and their military thugs. The causes of Brazil's ills are not found in European fascism. Typically, those who most defend this line of argumentation are Euro-Brazilians, educated in France. And if fascism refers to oligarchic military generals, then the latter turns out to be an accurate substitute for naming it. If it refers to organized crime, then pronounce that word instead of the endless and senseless evocation of Adolf Hitler. Speak of crucial minerals, yell about water theft, lament the loss of biodiversity, bemoan the opening of data centers, but get to the level of material relations and ditch ideological analysis. The true causes of crisis in Brazil are better found in what historian Gerald Horne has insistently called counter-revolutionary settler colonialism. As he stresses, when we omit the use of this historically negated political category, left-wing nationalism ends up perpetuating white supremacy, for it remains built upon class collaboration. University of Sao Paulo intellectuals seem to have lost their grip on Shakespeare's teachings in King Lear, namely how distribution should undo excess and each man have enough. It is pretty clear that for all the merits of their activism, when distribution includes professorial positions, limits are quick to behold. Anybody writing about Brazil in this country today belongs to the top 3% at the very most. Not only do they get proportionate returns from concentrated capital, their Latin American skin color tends fetishistically to be white. Brazil's ruling class strives for continued subjugation of the poor. Lula's recent whirlwind visits to BRICS countries secured a $4.5 billion USD pledge in trade and investment from the People's Republic of China. Part of this goes to building the Bio-Oceanic Railway that will link Brazil's Atlantic coast to the Shanghai to Chancay, Peru Pacific Ocean corridor. A transoceanic highway from Chile also to the port of Santos, Sao Paulo state, is already in its advanced stages. Even the French seem to want to make deals. In Paris, Lula received the prestigious French Medal of Honor, the only Brazilian to receive it since 19th century Emperor Peter II, Pedro II. Not even the failed sociologist Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who represents the cultural elite's ambitions, came close. In turn, President Emmanuel Macron pledged another 20 billion euros in investments over 5 years. Deservedly, Lula can lay claim to being a man more sinned against than sinning, and which each sin he suffers at home, his prestige only grows abroad. Hopes for development have seldom thrilled the Sao Paulo Faria Lima ruling class. Time and time again, it has shown its preference for wealth concentration over production, tax-free inequality over growth, even in nominal GDP terms. As such, Faria Lima expands the country's killing fields. It targets, with massive funding, the Mises, Liberdade, and Millennium Institutes through their Brazil Paralelo revisionistic video outlet to bedazzle hopeless youth with a grooveless mantra of libertarian ideology. The generals have momentarily been silenced as they respond to charges at the Supreme Court of allegedly fomenting a coup d'etat after Lula won the elections in November 2022. Now, while the president hovers over the international stage, Canada's Mark Carney, for his part, might be the only credible leader left in the G7. Klaus Schwab's project to train the future global elite has collapsed. Still, his father would be proud to see all his young global leaders towing the Israeli government's justification for exterminating the Palestinian population in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. Yet the G7 still has a problem. Zelensky is their zombie, and his hitmen seek blood in the North Atlantic. Admit nothing, deny everything, launch counterattack is the Zionist anthem shared amongst all G7 countries in complicity with the Gaza genocide, the Ukraine debacle, and illegal attack on Iran. Carney may now be leader of the pack. He has received laurels for aping Macron's groundless neo-Bonapartist fabrications over Putin's ambition to attack Europe. For Carney, the Russian menace even stretches over Canada's underdeveloped Arctic. There, in Canada's Amazon, the Inuit strive to secure supply lines of food, energy, and even drinkable water amidst threats to land and sovereignty from Bay Street mining speculators. For over a century, Russia has intensely developed its own Arctic coastline with little need for Canada's. The same cannot be said for the desires uttered by the southern neighbor. Who is King Lear's fool? As Lula interrupted the Honorable Prime Minister of Canada, due to translation problems, laughing angrily over the matter as only he is able to joyously. What he really meant to say was, nothing can come of nothing. Speak again. If you enjoy this video, please don't hesitate to press the like button and to subscribe to my channel. Most of the material available has been in Portuguese. I have a series on views of contemporary philosophy, for I'm Ph.D. in philosophy, political philosophy, contemporary French philosophy, and a scholar in international relations and economic theories. We also have a series on the philosophical critique of economic systems, a series in Portuguese on geoeconomic relations, examined by arguments and theses, and now this series called GeoEconomics with Philosophy. I'm Norman Madarasz. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you next time. Ciao.